I'm Keenan French. I'm a real estate broker here at Olympic Sotheby's International Realty.
My name is Sterling Stock, and I'm a associate broker here at Olympic Sotheby's International Real Estate Company.
Sterling and Keenan, thank you for sitting down with us today. We're going to talk about all things home inspection. So let's start by talking about what is a home inspection and what all does it entail? What does a buyer or a seller need to know about that process?
It's a different process for a buyer and a seller. So I think we wanted to maybe touch on what an inspection means in the process to a buyer and the same process on the seller side. And so Sterling, I guess you can talk about from a buyer's perspective going in to an inspection. As soon as they get the home under contract, their inspection period starts. The following day is day one. And then what do they do from then on?
Well, and usually you have, most standard, you have 10 days to have an inspection done and then to get a response to the seller. Usually you pick from 3 or 4 inspectors, find one that the buyer is comfortable with. You'll recommend, right? A buyer may not know, it's just you'll recommend 2 or 3 inspectors, and then you have to get one set up and then make an appointment with the seller. And then the buyer, if you can, it's always better for the buyer or buyers to be at the inspection process.
Yeah, definitely.
Because then they see what's going on as opposed to just reading a piece of paper a couple days later.
The inspector shows them in person physically what's going on and the problems, and usually goes over the reason why this is happening and why you want to keep up on it, or general maintenance that prevents it from happening. Also, during that inspection period, would you say that it's probably the most important part throughout the transaction, from start to finish? And it always seems to me, once we're through the inspection process, it's kind of like okay, we're ready, we're moving forward, and now it's just more about the lending process. But because it opens up negotiations kind of a second time once you get it under contract, you find out these latent defects with the house. Some of them are not on the disclosure. And then you either ask for a dollar amount to repair these things, or for these things to be fixed prior to closing.
I think the inspection for both the buyer and the seller, I think it's the most stressful time.
Yeah.
Yes, the house is under contract, but then the buyer wants to find out, do they want to continue and buy this home?
Yeah.
And so it can be very stressful because it's the negotiation process is opened up again, and so you have to determine the items that an inspector points out. Are they cosmetic? Are they structural? Or is it something that's a maintenance, right? There's kind of the main things. Cosmetic being, well, the paint is old or the carpet's old. A structural being the foundation, maybe the foundation is cracked. Maybe there's a deck that is either out of whack or is starting to get old and is rotten. Or is it something that is functional obsolescence, like a house built in 1972 is not going to have ground fault circuit interrupters, right? Like a car that doesn't have an airbag. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just when the house was built, and a seller's not going to want or need to bring it up to codes of 2025. Just because it doesn't have GFCIs, or just because it doesn't have an automatic shut off.
It's a used house.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and you mentioned earlier too, what's probably the most important thing on an inspection that you were talking about, that the biggest thing that I guess that's the most important for a buyer if a home has one of these issues?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we see around here of homes in the Northwest is water.
Yeah.
It's moisture. It's either water coming into your home, leaking roofs, leaking windows.
Roof's a big one.
Yep. Or moisture, right? So it's water coming into your house or water getting out of your house. That's what I would say is 70% of the issues we have.
Yeah.
It could be in the crawl space. It could be
plumbing
leaks, evaporation issues. So you might have mold in a bathroom or mold in an attic. Maybe windows are fogging up. It's moisture.
People are afraid of mold, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, that's because we have discoloration in a lot of the sheeting in the attics and here around in the Northwest. I'd probably say 75% of the homes have it because of the weather, because the climate change is so up and down and so wet, and moisture is definitely the biggest thing. So what all is covered on the inspection?
Well, on the inspection, an inspector is going to they're going to take the main components of the house, the plumbing, the electrical, the HVAC, those are the big things, and then all the appliances. And basically, they're just giving the house a checkup.
Yeah.
Every house is going to have a list. They all are. There's no perfect house. So every house is going to have some maintenance items. It may have a few minor defects, rarely, but there are some major defects. But they're going to point those out and find those. And they're going to crawl under the house. They're going to go up in the attic. They're either going to get on the roof, or if it's in the wintertime, they'll get up there or they'll look with binoculars, but they'll get up on the roof and check out the components and see how basically give the house basically a checkup.
Yeah, from foundation to the roof. And then also, so what's covered on inspection is that some inspectors do sewer scopes, right?
Yes.
That we talked about earlier, but some don't. So you would want to hire a company if it's in a neighborhood if it's in an older neighborhood.
So why would you want a sewer scope?
You'd want a sewer scope, especially in an older neighborhood, to check the lines. They basically scope it down with a camera to run the lines to see if the line's cracked, to make sure what the lines are made out of. There's in older neighborhoods back in the 70s, 60s, they used stuff that was called Orangeburg. That stuff is basically just made out of cardboard or paper that's soaked in oil, right? That I've had to replace a few lines in homes representing a buyer that it's pretty costly because you have to tear up all the concrete. I'm running out all the way to the sewer. And then that gives into another discussion of, where it's, I guess, the seller's responsibility, whether at the road or in what the county is.
Well, and that's in a sewer scope, most sellers don't know anything about as long as they run their water and flush their toilet and water's getting out, there's not a problem. So that's where a sewer scope, to spend that extra $400 to $600 can come back.
Yeah,
it's worth doing.
Yeah,
especially in an older home, you want to get that done.
So if I were a buyer, is it my responsibility to ask for a sewer scope, or would the inspector automatically know how to do that? Would you as an agent, I'm assuming, would maybe suggest that?
No, we would suggest the sewer, the scope, and you always want to, if the home's hooked up to a sewer, you always want to have that discussion with the buyer and let them know that is a possibility. Some buyers might think that don't want one or don't want to pay to have one done. But I would highly recommend or advise if it was in an older neighborhood. A few neighborhoods are popping up in my head, I'm not going to mention them, but a few neighborhoods that I've dealt with in the past and personally experienced and found problems with, and so yes, you definitely, that's on the buyer to definitely set that up and to pay for it.
Yeah. And you want it done. It's worth doing. And you're buying a $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 house. You want to spend
in the sewer scope alone. I think it's more like $250,000.
Maybe it is, yeah, because they just run a camera down.
Yeah, and they give you basically a video, and they can email it to you, and you can run through, and it gives you a report, and it's pretty easy. And then the septic, if the home is on a septic system, that's not included in the general inspection that you get done on the home. That's when that's on the seller to have the septic pumped and inspected at that point, and to make sure that everything's working properly. And that needs to be done at the time or before close as well. And if there is a problem with the septic system or anything, if there's a crack, then that's up to the seller to fix that prior to closing. So,
and you can have the line scoped. If it's an older house, you can still have the line scope, but the septic, that's a separate inspection.
Yeah.
I think we should talk about what does a seller have to do? What should a seller do? How do they get ready for an inspection?
Yeah, so, as we mentioned before, and we're talking about as a seller, they should probably prior to listing, filling out the seller disclosure, list all the latent defects with the home, right? That we were talking about, so that every buyer going into it already knows everything that the seller knows. They're basically being forthcoming and transparent upfront to all the buyers. And that's, I think, the biggest thing that we talked about knowing, because if they already disclosed all the issues that they know with the house, and then the buyer comes in and didn't ask for it on their offer up front, then that's something that the seller would say, well, I already disclosed this up front. Now you're asking me for, let's say, the windows to be replaced.
Yeah, I mean, common things like maybe you got rotten boards on the deck, maybe you have failed window seals, maybe a couple of fans aren't working. If the seller wants to disclose everything that they know, no matter how minor.
Over disclose.
Yes, because then once you get to the inspection, there's less surprises. No one wants surprises. That's the worst thing with inspections, when either a seller is surprised that there's something wrong with their house, or a buyer in walking through had no idea.
Yeah.
You can alleviate a lot of problems by filling out the disclosure form properly.
Yeah.
Up front, and that saves a lot of hassle, a lot of stress down the road.
Yeah.
So what happens after, when the inspection has been completed and the inspector writes up a report, how do you handle when you give a response to the seller?
Well, yeah. You mean giving the response to the seller, or going over the report?
Well, going over the report to prepare the response to give to the seller regarding the inspection.
Well, me personally, how I do it is either in person or over the phone, and we're both going over the report and asking my buyer, if I'm representing the buyer, going over these major issues that I think that are a problem, but asking the buyer, which one of these things are you concerned most about? And starting and writing a list, right? Making a list of, hey, do you want to take care of this yourself, or which one of these things pop out that you need to have done prior to closing, or that you want money for and you want to be reimbursed for, with a dollar amount and ask for it for closing. It's basically going over that with them, figuring out which ones are most important to my buyers, and then putting that on the 35R, which is an addendum which is what the buyers are requesting from the sellers, whether if that's a monetary value or an actual few items to be completed before close.
So when you say reimburse, what does that mean? In terms of the contract and how that's credited to the buyer? What does that
credited.
mean?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? How does that look?
Yeah. So, well, I guess you would need to come up with a value because you're writing an offer. The buyers are going into this not knowing these latent defects with the home or these issues with the house when they wrote the offer on the home. So when they go into an inspection, sometimes they find out these things, as we said just a second ago, and then you need to come up with a dollar amount that you think's fair, right? Because they didn't know that there was, a roof, right, that needed to probably be replaced, or it's on its last leg, and so they think that they're going to have to come out of pocket for another, $15,000 to $20,000. So whatever that dollar amount that's fair to them, do they think the seller needs to give them, $18,000 and pay for their roof for the next 30 years? Or do they think that the seller should just contribute maybe half of the dollar amount for the roof, so say $10,000? So it comes down to what the buyer thinks, I think, is fair, or what they want and what they think's fair that the sellers need to credit them.
If a buyer, let's say that a buyer asked for, let's say that there was 10 windows that had failed seals, and the buyer wants $5,000, and the seller says, I don't want to pay any of that. Can the seller back out of the agreement?
No. It comes down to the buyer, whether if the buyer's moving forward and the seller doesn't want to do it, then the buyer has to make that decision of, if they're not going to agree to this, it's always on the buyer, whether if they want to move forward with and deal with these 10 windows and still move forward with buying this house, or they can walk and basically rescind their offer. So as we talked about earlier, it always comes down to the buyer, because the seller can just say yes or no. The buyer has the decision whether they have the control and whether if they're moving forward or not, based on what the buyer's or the seller's response is.
What about we run in quite a bit where a toilet, let's say a toilet seal has started to leak and there's moisture under the floor and it's not rotted, but it's going to need to be replaced. Do you recommend getting that work done? Would you recommend to a buyer? Do you recommend getting that work done before closing, or is that when you would talk about maybe getting a credit?
Yeah.
Talk about that, about what's.
Yeah. So I always think, and I think you do too, Sterling, is that it's probably always best to get a credit so the buyer has control in who they're going to hire and who's going to do their work. Maybe they have a relationship already with this plumber, if we're talking about a leaking toilet. They already have a plumber that they've worked with in the past and have a relationship with, and so that they can call that person moving forward if the issue tends to happen again in the future. So I personally think that a credit is better, but if the seller wants to handle it and that's the only option that they're giving and they're not willing to give you the buyer a credit, then yeah, I would say definitely agree to, having the seller fix it or hire their own plumber or handyman, whatever their response is.
And you'd want, if the seller did it, you want the seller to take pictures along the way.
And provide an invoice or, and show proof of some way that this work was done and to show that they paid for it or, so that the buyer knows that it was done by somebody or who it was done by.
Well, you want it by a licensed bonded contractor, right? That's all, any repairs, right?
Yeah.
Except for, minor cosmetic things. You want a seller to hire a licensed bonded contractor that's going to be there. But there has been some problems running when a seller hires the contractor and the seller has the work done, and you can go and re-inspect it, and the buyer and the agent may say, well, this wasn't done to professional standards, and then you could have a mess on your hands.
Yeah.
Whereas if you get a credit, then the buyer has full control. They can hire an inspector of their choice, get exactly the color of grout they want, the type of molding, the type of caulk. They have total control.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to worry about getting it done before closing either. You can do it at your leisure. Maybe you want to do a whole bathroom remodel and not just the floor.
Yeah. And then you just brought up a good point. So, and then you asked me, how do you come up with that value? Well, we also, when these things are pointed out on inspection, you usually have a professional or a specialist come out, like a plumber, to actually give you a bid or an estimate. And that's how we find out these values. As us with real estate agents and with buyers, that's how we know the amount to fix it, is because we have a specialist come out. And if it's, if you can't get a specialist out right away, we have an option to trigger the additional 5 days for the inspection, usually too, is what we have. So that gives you an additional 5 business days if you wanted to get out a professional licensed plumber, electrician, roofer, whatever, so that gives you enough time.
Well, and I think we should also talk about, because it is a negotiation, is from both the buyer and the seller, when there is either a monetary value or work orders to be done, I think it's important to talk about, how was the house marketed, right? Was it marketed as a fixer?
Mm-hmm.
Was it marketed as remodeled? Maybe it's a flip.
Yeah.
How long has it been on the market?
Yeah.
Right? All those come into, talk about a little about how those come into play when you do have an inspection, depending on maybe the neighborhood, maybe the location, the price point, all those are going to come into. So talk a little bit about what you look for.
Well, I feel like most homes are not going to be marketed as like a fixer, right? Because when they're doing their marketing, they're trying to market and get as many people through the door as possible. But sometimes there are houses that you definitely, the photos can't hide, and that it needs to be updated or fixed up. And so people do say, put your own touch on it, or and so that's keywords you look for, in the marketing remarks, that that there's going to be some issues, or there hasn't been the maintenance done over the years, or it needs to be updated. Definitely, if we're talking about, you're saying moving forward, if the home definitely needs to be fully remodeled or that needs tons of work versus a home that's already, is that what you mean?
Yeah, just I mean, to me, if I'm representing a buyer and a home's maybe been on the market for 4 months, and that we go through the inspection process and there are some things, I'm the buyer and we might be more aggressive in asking for more concessions, as opposed to if it was just on the market and there's 3 offers.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And because it comes down to, does the buyer, do they want this house?
Yeah.
Or are you going to reject the house because it has a couple of windows that are bad, or maybe it has a deck that needs to be redone?
Well, a home that is a good sign, is that a home that's been on the market for 6 months, versus a home that's only been on the market for a week. Your strategy is different, right? You are more aggressive. The buyers are more aggressive when the home's been sitting for a long time. So yeah, they can come in and ask for a larger credit, on the inspection, or they can ask for it up front on the offer versus a home that's just on the market and there's already been 10 showings on it and you might be competing. Then yes, you're right, your offer is going to be different between those two scenarios.
And I think from a seller standpoint, I know that I've run into this before many times where when you do get an offer and let's say you've got 10 items that the buyer wants,
Yeah.
whether they want a credit or not. And what I tell the sellers, I go, look, you got to keep in mind, seller, that if we don't come to an agreement and the house goes back on the market, what's going to happen with the next buyer?
Yeah.
The next
Most
buyer,
likely gonna
most
ask
likely
the
the
same thing.
same things are going to
Yeah.
come out.
Yeah.
So how are you going to address them? Most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, your best buyer is your first buyer.
Yeah.
So you want to get an agreement worked out with that buyer. Otherwise, you're going to start the whole dance over again,
Yeah.
and you got to go through the stress of another inspection.
Yeah.
And that's why you want to disclose everything up front, know what your house is, what may be asked for, and be prepared for that when the time comes. Because most of the time, you don't want to put the house back on the market because then it also has a little bit of a black mark too,
Yeah,
right?
It does, because that's the first call that we get when it goes back to market. It's like, why did it go back to market? What's wrong with the house? And then everybody that maybe is at home and just not working with an agent yet, and maybe just scrolling through Zillow or Redfin, and they had that home tagged, they're thinking the same thing and going through all these scenarios. What's wrong with the house? And it a lot of times, especially, it depends on the market too. But, if the market is a little slower, during the times, it's nothing wrong with the house or due to the inspection. It's based on, the buyer just got cold feet and walked. But yeah, that's a different subject.
Well, I think we should talk too a little bit about disclosure laws in this state, right? With our disclosure form. And once you have an inspection,
You have to disclose everything.
well, so it used to be where the seller got the inspection, right?
Yeah.
So the seller would get a copy of the inspection and they can see everything that a inspector wrote down.
About 4 years ago, it changed. Yeah.
And whether the inspector was correct or not, it did not matter at that point unless the buyer refuted it, or excuse me, the seller refuted it with another inspector or another, basically a contractor. You have to disclose those.
You have to change your disclosure
Yes.
and add all of those latent defects with the house that were picked out by the and they were shown and on the report disclosed by the inspector. And then you don't want to have to go back to the market and have a whole list on your seller disclosure, your Form 17. Yeah, so definitely trying to figure out with that first buyer and come to a resolution is the biggest deal. You don't want to lose that buyer based on a couple small items.
Right.
And so that's why it's important to have us negotiating those things for the buyers and the sellers on each side.
And then when an inspection is done now, it's the buyer, or in this case, the selling agent, is not allowed to give the inspection to the seller or to the listing agent without their consent. You have to have written consent. So that way, that inspection is property of the buyer. So the buyer looks at it and the buyer's agent. It is not disclosed unless the seller asks for it. Because once the seller asks for it, and if the buyer gives it to him, the seller has to disclose everything that's on that.
Yeah, and there is now on our forms on the offer on the 35 on the inspection addendum, the buyer has the option to check that box, right, and to ask for the inspection report. And then if they don't up front on the offer, they, like you said, need to write an email at least in writing or request that portion or the whole report so that they have that in the file.
What about, I know the market's changed a little bit compared to 3 or 4 years ago, but what happens when you have a buyer, or do you talk to a buyer depending on a multiple offer situation? What about waiving an inspection? What are your feelings on that?
The market is a little different. It still does happen where you are competing with other buyers, even in this market. back in the 2020, 2021, when almost, we were working with multiple offer situations most of the time, some of the buyers were waiving their inspections and to make their offer, better and look better towards their competing offers. So even though they're waiving the inspection, I always advise every buyer to get an inspection, even if they're not having one, to still, hey, we're still performing an inspection. So the buyer knows going forward all of the latent defects with the house. They know that the seller is not going to make any repairs or give them credit for anything. But still moving forward, they know everything going on with the house and all the latent defects, so that if they have that knowledge and they're like, whoa, this is too much, then they still have the option to back out and rescind their offer and basically kill the deal.
So in that case, it'd be like a pass-fail inspection. So
Yeah.
I mean, all the time, we always recommend you want to have an inspection.
Yeah.
And that's just, it's better for the seller.
Yeah.
So that avoids any
Liability.
liability afterwards. It's better for the buyer to know what's going on. So it's,
Yeah.
you want to have an inspection. And I know that there was a time period when buyers were waiving them, but inspection is extremely important.
I mean, most of my buyers, even when they did have to waive an inspection, because maybe in that scenario that we were in a multiple offer and there was 3 to 5 offers, the listing agent would call me and tell me on the phone, like, hey, we have these other 2 offers and these people are waiving their inspection. We're going to give you the chance to match that or not. And then we go back and talk to our buyers, right? And say, this is what we're competing against. And so do you want to waive this? And sometimes, they were waiving the inspections and just to compete because they wanted the home. That's the ultimate goal, is getting the home, right? But we still want to perform and have those inspections. But did you have many buyers not just saying we're not going to do an inspection in that time period?
Yeah, I had a few buyers.
Yeah.
And fortunately there was not anything, as they lived in the home, there was not anything. But there is, whether it's something like a sewer, right? A sewer problem, or maybe some type of a roofing issue. Again, the big things with water, but most of the time it's okay. 'Cause like I said, every home is going to have a list.
Yeah.
What about, I know that sometimes buyers think that appraisers do inspections.
Yeah.
Or that's part of the inspection process. Talk a little bit about appraisers and what they say and don't say and what they're looking for, but an appraiser is not an inspection.
An appraiser is not an inspector. They're out to appraise the home, its value, basically, just for the lender's sake. That you have a purchase price, and the appraiser's just going out there to make sure that the buyer's not overpaying, right, or for the home. And the biggest thing for me when I think the appraiser and I'm working with the seller at that point is, do you have your carbon monoxide detectors, your earthquake straps, smoke alarms? Because those are the things that they call out, that they are going to have to come back out to the house for a second visit if those things aren't currently on the house, or you don't have a CO detector in the current or in the right spots or locations on the house. So that's what pops up in my head with working with the seller.
And I think also when it comes to inspections and the whole selling process, I think sometimes a lot of sellers it can happen where they're told that they shouldn't take a VA or an FHA offer because the homes are harder to pass the process, which is, I think that is uninformed. They're uninformed. FHA and VA, there are a list of things that appraisers look at that may cause it not to get financing, but most homes are still going to have no problem with VA or FHA or VA. So if they look for safety issues, right? They'll look for a broken window or peeling paint, or things like that. But it's a small list. It's easy to do, and so a lot of times, because sellers are either told or afraid of
or they don't want to fix up the stuff. Right?
Inspection process. So they're missing out on good, well qualified buyers that can get their homes sold quicker. And so I'm all for FHA. And VA financing. And
I just went and showed that was a fixer. The home needed a lot of work, last week actually. And it said that it could only go conventional or cash out. I mean, my buyer was an FHA buyer previously, but they could probably go conventional with talking with their lender. But the home needed a lot of work, and so the seller and the listing agent did not want to take a FHA or VA because of that reason that you just mentioned. Because they probably didn't want to fix up those things, or they knew that those latent defects were going on with the house and they didn't want to put in that extra money or work into the home because they were trying to sell it as is, but you're saying that probably would fly and possibly could go FHA based on the work, right, that needed to be done.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's because it needs new carpet or new windows or, GFCIs, it's still going to go FHA or VA.
It's more of that's a seller is not willing to do that, right? Or to
because they're uninformed.
Yeah.
Or their agent is uninformed.
Yeah.
So, if you're a buyer that has VA or FHA financing, that's why you need an agent that knows.
Yeah.
Turning back to inspections, can you guys talk a little bit about your role as agents throughout that process from both the buyer and seller side? Are you advising the client on the steps that need to be taken? What do you guys do during that process?
Yeah.
Well, during the actual process, right, during the inspection, you're there to be a sounding board for the buyer, and you're there to open the home, so you're going to let the inspector do their job. Yeah, is what you're going to do.
You're there to listen to the inspector basically, and like Sterling said, is also you're another set of ears and eyes, right? Listening to the inspector go through the whole house, and so just because if the buyers are there and they're telling them that, you have both of you now listening to the inspector when he's explaining, these issues with the house. And then you'll eventually, the following day get the report that, talks about and lists all that stuff. And then it's easier for us, to go through and talk about these things because we were already there listening with the buyer about each one of these items that they touch on going through the house. And then our other role is, yes, we set up the inspection at the beginning. So as once you get the home under contract, your inspection period starts, whether if that's 5 days, to 10 days. It's usually the standard is a 10-day inspection period. Also, moving forward, I guess 5 days, I don't know if we want to touch base on that, but 5 days, anything 5 days or less is business days when you're talking on contractual basis on a purchase and sale agreement. But anything above 5 days, those are calendar days. So a 5-day inspection, depending on when you get the home under contract, could be as long as a 7-day inspection or a 10-day inspection based on if there's holidays or weekends, because it doesn't count the weekends either. So sometimes a 5-day inspection could give the buyer enough time to have an inspection, get the report back, have a specialist or out to the house.
Yeah, because you can have a second inspection if you can get a specialist out, a roofer, a plumber, electrician. But I think that the main thing, our main role, if you're both working for the buyer, whether you're a listing agent or selling it, is to advise your client on what you believe is the best strategy going forward, how to either get the items fixed or how to be compensated and the time frames involved in doing it. How's it going to affect the closing? What contractors to recommend? We're always trying to find contractors, which is tough, but it's mostly advising on the steps going forward and how we want to structure the negotiation and structure maybe the inspection response and what we're willing to do and how much they want to still buy the house.
Yeah, and making sure that the buyers, like you said, know the timeline on the inspection period, because that is important. And then once we do give our inspection response to them, there's a time period on that too, that the sellers have 3 days after that to respond. And then if you still haven't came to a resolution, then the buyer has another 3 days after that. So just making sure that the buyer knows the timelines is very important.
And an inspection, the whole inspection process can take as long as 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Depending on what's negotiated, the timelines are negotiated, how many, if you need to get a secondary inspection, a specialist out there, And then the seller has time to decide. Maybe the seller wants to get someone out there. So timelines are important, but it can be as long as 3 weeks.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important. And once I feel relieved once you're through either representing a buyer and a seller on each side. Once you've gotten through that process and came to a resolution, it just feels like, you know, the majority of the work of the transaction is completed, you know, and at that point, it's usually on the lender to get all of their work done.